We're trying to build this series that we've been doing, talking about foundations. And it has been a rather timely thing from a physical standpoint because of all the things that we've had to deal with that have affected our physical foundation. But we are literally weathering the storm of that and doing just fine. When you open the Gospel of John, it begins in just a tremendous way. It begins talking about the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. It transitions to the glorious statement that is said in verse 14 that this Word became flesh, and we beheld Him as grace and truth. And the point of that is, beheld Him as true grace. We've then seen throughout the rest of this book, as we've been looking at the things that John has written, how this one that was the Word that took on flesh has interacted with His creation. We've seen that by looking at the Good Shepherd. We've seen that by looking at His relationship with the Pharisees. We've seen that by His relationship to miracles. And this morning we're going to see this by the relationship that Jesus has to three of the closest people, at least that we have on biblical record, that were not His apostles on the earth. Perhaps we all have expectations. And it might not also be foreign to anyone's experience that in those expectations at times bring disappointment because we do not attain the expectations that we had laid out. Maybe it's the expectation of God. Maybe we had an expectation of God, and in our perception, that expectation was not delivered. Maybe it's an expectation in a marriage. And as that marriage has developed over years, that there's been disappointments and discouragements that have happened, and those expectations have not been attained. Yes, there are expectations when we have children. Those newborn babies are born with such high expectations, hopes, and dreams. And then along the way, they grow up and have their own mind and their own free moral agency to choose. And sometimes those choices are disappointments to the expectations that parents have laid out. And maybe it's the expectations that we have of life generally. That we expected life to go smoothly. We didn't expect the twists and the turns, the hills and the valleys, the curves, the potholes that happen along the way. Those things that come like with a diagnosis that says, this is life-threatening. This is terminal. Or, we don't know if your loved one's going to make it for 24 hours. As a result, we, at looking at the failure of those expectations, then think, well, if there's a God and He's good, then why haven't my expectations reached their fulfillment? Or why is there, even if there's a God that's good and powerful, why is there even evil in this world? And as a result of that, we then come to a conclusion that God is not powerful and God cannot affect the lives of men and women in this world. I want to tell you that's a decision we make by choice because there are other options available. Those are not conclusions that must be made. Those are conclusions that people make grasping. Because once we take that dark turn, away from God, understand it doesn't make anyone better. No one becomes stronger. And few, it's not impossible, but few turn around from the dark turn that they've made to go downward. The question then is, have we been left with unanswered hopes and dreams, unanswered expectations, to be left just in this world asking the question, does God even care? Well, if there's ever a passage in Scripture that would shout affirmatively to us that God cares, it must be John chapter 11. When we begin to look at John chapter 11, we can see that this is a story that affects everybody. It is real. This is not a fantasy. This is a story that is real, and it's a story that Jesus says to these close friends of his, I want you to understand, I hear you, and I know how you hurt, but there is hope for you. Now, there's going to come a time in this narrative that it seems like all hope is gone. And so we understand that this is a thing that is real. Maybe the crisis is financial. Maybe the crisis is a loss of a child. Maybe the crisis is a dissolution of a marriage. Maybe it's the loss of a parent. Maybe it's the loss of a mate. Maybe it's an illness that is life-threatening, life ongoing, from which one will never heal. But Jesus in this story tells us, I have not left you without care. The resurrection is powerful. But what John chapter 11 tells us is, I did not leave you on your own to endure pain, to endure hurt, and to endure loss. And so when we begin to look at John chapter 11, I want to break it down in a few ways for us. The first thing I want us to look at is the concern, the confusion, and the confidence that occurs. Look with me in John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and his sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother was Lazarus and was sick. Therefore the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, him whom you love is sick. Notice you have here in verses 1 and 2, Mary and Martha, who have a brother by the name of Lazarus that is sick, but they know that Jesus is 2 days away. And so what they do is in verse 3, they send for him. Now what they do is a completely human thing. Isn't that what we would do? If we had someone that was sick, nigh unto death, and we knew there was someone that could do something to help them, and they were that close, that what we would do is that we would reach out for them to come and help, to come and help heal. And it says, when Jesus heard that, he said, the sickness is not unto death, for the glory of God, the Son of God may be glorified through it. That's a strange response. That's not a response that might be expected. The response is, yes, I've got a few things left to finish here. Just give me a minute and I'll be right there. But that's not what Jesus says. And what Jesus answers is he answers with death as its backdrop. Death is not what this is about. Death is the backdrop that takes place here. And so Jesus says the sickness is not unto death, for the glory of God. The Son of God may be glorified through it. Death is going to be an avenue, a strange avenue through which God is going to be glorified. And so here you have the concern of the sisters, so that verse 5 says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Does that not just leave you shaking your head? Oh yeah, I hear, I got the message received. Oh, give me 2 more days. I got to tell you, I don't think that's what Mary and Martha were expecting to hear. He said, look, this death is going, it's not sickness unto death. Understand that. They're going to come to understand that. They don't get it yet. But this sickness is not a death, but it's going to be an avenue through which God is going to be glorified. But give me 2 days, 2 days more, which will mean 4 days before Jesus is going to be there. But here you see the concern of the sisters. They know Jesus can heal their brother. He has healed the soldier's servant. He has healed Jairus' daughter. They know that he can heal their brother. But the response comes, give me 2 more days. Now verse 7 begins with the confusion. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. Then the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews sought to stone you, and you are going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Understand what the disciples are saying in verse 8. Because verse 8 goes back to chapter 8. In chapter 8, remember, they pick up stones to stone him because they said, you are not of your father Abraham. You are of the devil. Your father is the devil because he was a liar from the beginning. And they are incredulous about that. And the Lord says, well, if you were like your father Abraham, then you would do what your father Abraham did. And you're not acting like him. And so the disciples are remembering how they picked up stones to stone him, and what they're saying is, look, Lord, we were just there a day or 2 ago. And if we go back, they're going to stone you. Now here's an ellipsis that is supplied. Here's something supplied there. Necessarily concluded is, if they stone you, they're going to stone us too. We're going to get it. You don't want to go back there yet. And Jesus tells them, said, look, fellas, I'll walk in the light. And look, I'm going to leave you a light that is going to be a lighting for you, that when I go, you'll not walk in darkness anymore. It's going to be a light that will never go out. It's going to be a light like you've never understood before. So you need to walk with me so that you may be in the light. And so Jesus then says in verse 11, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then the disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought he was speaking about taking a rest. Notice Jesus throws in the idea that Lazarus sleeps. He's already mentioned to the sisters that this is not a sickness unto death. But notice how these people pick up on what Jesus says. They said, oh, he is asleep. They give a clinical diagnosis of what's taking place there. And Jesus said, no, he's not just asleep. Understand, he's speaking of his death. He spoke of his death. And then he plainly said, Lazarus is dead. And verse 15 is another one of those head-shaking comments, because he says, and I'm glad for your sake that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Wait a minute. Time out. You're 2 days away. You love Lazarus. You love Mary. You love Martha. And you can come. And now our brother Lazarus is sick unto death. And now then you tell us that Lazarus has died. And you rejoice over that. You are glad for that. You mean you are more glad that Lazarus died? You rejoice more over the death of Lazarus than the fact that you could come and heal him? What is there possible that could be more important? What possibly could be more important that you would rejoice over the death of Lazarus to take place more than healing Lazarus from his death? What could be more important than that? And Jesus tells them, I am glad for your sakes that I was not there. Why? That you might believe. Jesus said this sickness is not unto death. It is going to be an opportunity, a means by which the glory of God is going to be seen. And furthermore, it is going to be a means by which you will be brought to faith. And what Jesus is saying is more important than the physical life of Lazarus is that you come to believe. And the reason that he rejoices that Lazarus died is not because he's some morbid individual, but because he knows that what's going to happen to Lazarus is going to be an occasion that is going to produce faith that these people need. Pause just a moment. I wonder, would that have been the order that we would have taken? Would we have put more emphasis on this is an occasion for you to believe over the sustaining of life of someone that we love? We place a high value on life. And Jesus is not denigrating that high value of life. But what he's doing is he's elevating the importance of faith, of their believing over the life of Lazarus himself. Jesus came so that we might learn to believe. In fact, you have in John chapter 20, verse 31, these signs are written, why? Here it is, that you may believe. Remember in John chapter 1 through 4, the statement that is repeated over and over is that they believe, they believe. The statement that is found in John chapter 5 through John chapter 12, with this exception, is they did not believe. Now he comes to these friends, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, and he says, I'm glad that Lazarus died. They come and they take the body of Lazarus. It is prepared for the grave. And Jesus' comment is not, oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't here 2 days early. I'm sorry I waited. Jesus said, I'm glad that he died. Not because he was glad that he died, but because something else greater happened. It produced belief in them. So you have the concern of the sisters. You have the confusion of the disciples. But you have the expression of confidence of the Christ. That leads us then to a second breakdown of this text, and that begins Jesus' message to Martha. You have an interlude here that takes place. It's just a commentary that happens that John supplies that just kind of fills in some of the nuances in the background. So it says, so when Jesus came, he found they'd already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. So here's all the events that are happening kind of as the cameo appearance is taking place. You have one thing happening here as Jesus is talking, and now Lazarus has died, and now then 4 days later he comes, and you have these conversations taking place. Then verse 21 comes with the conversation of Martha. Now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Behold, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give to you. Martha hasn't got it yet. But there's a transformation fixing to take place in Martha. Because now you have in verses 23 and 24, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Then he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Jesus said, Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. But now then, anything you ask, the Father will do. And Jesus said, look, understand, your brother will rise again. And she says, I know he will rise again when? in the resurrection. Understand what Jesus is telling her here is not that resurrection is something in the future. Yes, resurrection is a future event. But what he's telling her is resurrection is in a person. And you need to understand the person. She says, I know he'll rise again. Yes, I understand there's a resurrection. Jesus said, no, I'm not talking about that. I am the resurrection. I am. There's that I am statement. I am the resurrection and the life. Understand, resurrection is not a future event. It's in a person. And I am the person. I am the resurrection and the life. And he who believes in me, though he lives, may not die. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And then he asked the question, do you believe this? Over and over again in the ministry of Jesus, you have this question. Do you believe? Who is Jesus? Do you believe? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Do you believe? There's the pivotal question. There's the question that Martha had to answer, and there's the question that we have to answer today. Do you believe? Do you believe what? I am the Christ. I am the resurrection and the life. And notice what Martha says. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are, notice, the Christ. Ringing in your ear, do you hear Peter saying, you are the Christ, the only begotten Son of God? Who is Jesus? Who do you say that Jesus is? Do you believe? And she said, yes, Lord. I believe you are the Christ. Translated, I believe you are the Messiah. I believe you are the anointed one, the Son of God, who has come into this world. Mary has traveled a long distance in a short period of time. Lord, if you'd been here, he would not have died. But I know he'll rise again. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Do you believe? Do you believe I am the Messiah? Yes, I believe that you are the Messiah. But Lazarus is still dead. He's still in the tomb. So now we come to a third breakdown of the text in which we have a conversation that Jesus has with Mary and Martha. So beginning in verse 28, you kind of have a rehearsal of everything that has just taken place. And you have this time Mary speaking. And as Mary is speaking, she's saying some of the same things that Martha has said, which kind of brings to mind, okay, what have these sisters been going through at this time? For 2 days, they've been waiting for Jesus to come. At this point in time, Lazarus is dead. What have they been thinking? What have they been talking about? What have they been doing? I can just see Mary has been sitting, holding his hand, stroking his brow, loving him, and she has been bowed in prayer, praying. And I can just see Martha flitting about, concerned with the things of the house, making sure all the meals are provided and everything is in order that needs to take place in the house while Mary is doing that. And so Jesus comes, and it says, verse 32, then when Mary came where Jesus was and she saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping. And he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Mary says the same thing her sister does. And they bring Jesus to the tomb, and all that are accompanying there are weeping. And notice it says that Jesus groaned and his spirit was troubled. Jesus was touched. He was touched by what was taking place with Mary and Martha and those around her, and he is also touched that now he's coming to the tomb that is sealed with a stone of one of his very best friends, Lazarus, and he is moved by that. And the text tells us how he's moved, how his spirit is troubled, in that Jesus wept. Is there anything that speaks to identifying with humanity more than the pathos that one feels for the loss that someone has of a loved one? Many of us have been at the viewing at a funeral home, and the banter that takes place as the conversation in the viewing happens. The conversation that takes place remembering the good things about the one who has passed away. The stories that are shared. The life that has been lived, how much value this person was to me, or we know how dear this person is or was to you. We share. There's a pathos that shares in that suffering. We groan in our spirit, and we, like Jesus, weep as well. And the observation is, they said that he loved him. But he waited for 4 days. Wasn't he about 2 days too late? Jesus came just at the right time. You see, the gospel is powerful and effective if the gospel comes at the right time. And here is grace and truth. Here is life. Here is the Word that created all things. Here's the one that turned the water to wine. Here's the one that healed the lame man. Here is the one that spoke all things into existence. And he comes not 2 days late. He comes just at the right time. And Jesus' tears identify him with us in our tears. Jesus is not going to leave us alone in our hurt and in our loss. And nothing shouts louder than this story with Lazarus, and how Jesus groaned in his spirit and how he wept. But there's another important conversation that takes place. And that's the conversation that Jesus has with Lazarus. It says in verse 38, then Jesus, again groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there's a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you, if you believe, you would see the glory of God? Then they took away the stone from that place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me, but because these people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, before we look at what is said next to Lazarus, just pause there. Notice Jesus stops and he prays. Is Jesus praying because he's not sure about he's going to raise Lazarus? Is Jesus praying because he's run short of power here? He's lost the power to raise the dead? No, Jesus is not praying for permission. Jesus is not praying for help. What he's saying is, Father, yes, this is going to be the time that you are glorified. And as a result of what is fixing to take place, these people are going to believe. Lord, this is what we've been talking about. And now your glory is going to be seen. And now these people will believe. And so Jesus, when he had said these things, cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. Could you just have imagined the silence and anticipation? You said, this is not unto death, but that he would rise, because you are the resurrection and the life. And now you just said, Lazarus, come forth. And if he doesn't come forth, everything blows up in his face. But what happens? And he who died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with cloth. And Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary had seen the things Jesus did, believed in him. Would we think that would have been the obvious response? That those that were there that day, when he said, Lazarus, come forth, and he comes forth, and the grave clothes loose because he commands them to be loosed, that all therefore would believe. However, some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things that Jesus did. And the chief priests, the Pharisees, gathered a council and said, what shall we do? This man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said to him, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that is expedient, a necessary evil, for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Which one of those responses amazes you more? Is it more amazing that Jesus spoke and Lazarus comes forth and the grave clothes are loosed and that all believe? Or that the opposite response by the Pharisees and those that are ruling is, look, we had a problem on our hands before. We got a real problem now. It's one thing to turn water to wine. It's another thing to make a man heal a man on the Sabbath who's been lame for 38 years. But now we've got someone, listen, there might be sleight of hand on the other side that can be explained away, but you're not going to explain a guy that's been in the tomb for 4 days and now he rises. And their only response is, look, if we don't stop this, this is going to spread like a prairie fire and we're going to lose our place in the nation. Don't you understand? This man's got to die. He's got to die for the nation. Well, he's going to die for the nation, but not like Caiaphas thinks he's going to die for the nation. The only thing they could think of, they couldn't rejoice that now this man that is dead has been made alive. The only thing they could think of is, how are we going to now put this man to death along with the fellow he just raised from the dead to death? But Jesus said this was done that the glory of God might be seen. The next time that we find ourselves in circumstances where expectations have not been met and where disappointments seem to overwhelm and discouragement seems to destroy us, remember Lazarus. And remember what Jesus did for Lazarus and what he did for Mary and Martha. And remember that when Jesus comes in his time, that when he comes, it will be for his glory. See, we see death from a mortal point of view. That's the only perspective that we have. And we see death as an end point. But what this picture is doing is it's taking death and looking back. And looking back, he says, this man's death was not a loss. This man's death, looking back from eternity, was for the glory of God. It may not be in every case, in every circumstance, that can be determined. But understand, looking back, it may be that death, that person that we mourn, that we lost, like Mary and Martha have lost their brother Lazarus, has not been a loss that is a loss, but that has been a loss that has been able to demonstrate the glory of God. That's how God looked at it. That's not loss. And he used the opportunity to emphasize to them, greater than his life is the fact that you be brought to believe. Jesus said to Lazarus, come forth. And one day, that voice will speak again. And one day, every person in the grave will come forth. None will deny the call. None will refuse his power. The question is, are we walking in the darkness or are we walking in the light? You see, if we're walking in the darkness like Caiaphas and the others did, then understand, death wins. Death becomes the champion. Death doesn't become the period. Death becomes the exclamation mark. But if we're walking in the light, then that death can produce the glory of God and be a sign that brings people to believe. And that great scene that John paints in his Revelation in chapters 4 and chapter 5 of the throne of God. The question is being asked, who can loose the seal? There's no one that can loose the seal. Death now has its grip. Who's going to loose the seal? And the elders speak and say, John, it's okay. The Lion from the tribe of Judah, he shall come and he shall loose, because he has the power over the grave. He has the keys over both death and life. He will come, and when he comes, he will reign. He is the one that is the king. He is the one that has been crucified. He is the Lamb whose blood has been slain. He is the one that will enable all of us to rise. John, it's the Lion of the tribe of Judah that is going to enable all of us not to live today, but to live. Because he is the resurrection and the life. The question for me and you is this: do I believe? And if I believe what Martha said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, then there is only one response. Lord, cleanse me and make me whole. And he said, I will wash your sins away. Come unto me. While we stand and while we sing.